Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and to rediscover. The prophetic power of James Baldwin's voice and his searching explorations of race and America's unfulfilled promises have never been more illuminating or more necessary. This evening's event continues Reading James Baldwin Now, a series of engagements with Baldwin's work led by gifted scholars, writers, and teachers.
Piece there. Against the backdrop of what would be the Watts riots, against the backdrop of the promise of the Voting Rights Act, against the backdrop of the violence of Selma, against the backdrop of what would happen just a month later, just a year later in June of '66 when Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture declares Black Power, Baldwin offers this account. And in this account, he's insisting that white America refuses to confront its past. It refuses to confront, right, what it has done and how those actions have shaped, right, the way in which white Americans see themselves and the way in which they see others, the way in which the past shapes, disfigures, distorts the very sense of self, and how the evasion, in interesting sorts of ways, generates monstrous consequences. There's a passage that I know I shouldn't be reading to you because you've read it before, and it's only 1,500 words. Ebony, the editor of Ebony, asked Baldwin to write it at the last minute, paid him about $1,000, and Baldwin turned it around pretty quickly. But there's this line, this paragraph that I read over and over again, that's at the heart of my work and the heart of the way in which I think about history and the problems that we confront in this country right now as we see and feel and experience the reassertion of the lie. Baldwin said, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. This is on page 722. I know you're there already. To the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because thereafter one enters into battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins the attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom, which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history. In an interview with David Lemming about Henry James as the ambassadors, Baldwin would equate freedom. He equates freedom with the end of innocence, because there you entered the game and you're willing to face the consequences. Baldwin he invokes personal maturity because he thinks this, shall we say, unhealthy attachment to youthfulness, this unhealthy attachment to being young and innocent, right, blocks the way to reaching for a kind of wisdom that is found, right, in a certain kind of maturity. But he says that as this country evades that hard work, this country, and particularly white people, right, tell themselves a story that flatters them. It's like listening to Donald Trump's speech at the end of the RNC convention or whatever that was, where he invoked this story of a virgin continent and plains. I mean, he had to tell the story of America as some way a redeemer nation, the shining city on the hill, to avoid our contradictions and our failures, to avoid what we've done. And Baldwin writes, people who imagine that history flatters them are impaled on that history like a butterfly on a pin. I love that line. Like a butterfly on a pin. And he says, this is the place in which it seems to me most white Americans find themselves impaled. Impaled. They are dimly or vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to release themselves from it. And they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence. This history that we tell ourselves, it distorts our character, it disfigures who we are, it blinds us to the human being right in front of us, it flatters us, and it fixes us in the place that we happen to stand. And Baldwin says this is the challenge because in some ways, right, white Americans believe the history they tell, and Black Americans end up believing it too, believing we deserve our circumstances, believing that we are, in fact, what the world tells us we are. And he says, and in some ways, we believe that insofar as we believe the story that white America tells itself, we believe that that's the only way to secure power. And then that deepens, according to Baldwin in the essay, this sense of fear. Because in this moment, on the eve of cities burning, white Americans fear that Black folk believe that the only way to achieve genuine freedom is to do unto others what has been done to them. So Baldwin is suggesting to white, as he says, white men, hear me, a confrontation with the past, a confrontation with what we have done, what you have done, and what it has done to your sense of self and how it blinds you to the reality of those in front of you, to the reality of the life that you created, to the reality of the world that you've created. Otherwise, you have reconciled yourself to the monstrous consequences of the lie. There's another moment in the essay that strikes me. And I want to suggest, I at least should mention this. A good friend of mine, Nicholas Bukola, wrote a wonderful book entitled The Fire Upon Us. And he makes the argument, I might be convinced by this, that the essay is actually a response to William Buckley. You know, Baldwin was on open mind with Buckley, and he didn't do so well because Buckley pissed him off so. And Nick thinks that this essay is actually a response to Buckley, and it may very well be true. Buckley would be a clear example of exactly what Baldwin is talking about with regards to a refusal to encounter one's history honestly. But there's another moment in this essay that's really fascinating to me, and it's a moment where Baldwin riffs on W.E. Du Bois's The Veil, the metaphor of the veil, but he translates it as the curtain. Right, as the curtain, and he plays on this curtain in relation to the Iron Curtain, right? And I just wanted to direct your attention to this moment in the piece because I think it's of course an indication of Baldwin's genius, but it's so insightful. He says the American situation is very peculiar, and it may be without precedent in the world. No curtain under heaven is heavier than the curtain of guilt and lies behind which white Americans hide. This is why the first chapter of Begin Again is entitled The Lie. That curtain, he says, may prove to be yet more deadly to the lives of human beings than that iron curtain of which we speak so much and know so little. And he says, the American curtain is color, right? Echoing Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk, the Souls of Black Folk. You know, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The American curtain is color, the veil and the color line brought together in this extraordinarily economical sentence. The economy of this sentence is just striking. White men have used this word, this concept, to justify unspeakable crimes, not only in the past, but in the present. One can measure very neatly the white American's distance from his conscience, from himself, by observing the distance between white America and Black America. What happens behind the veil? It's not so much us seeing ourselves through the eyes of another, it's what happens to the soul of white folk. To echo an essay Du Bois writes in Dark Water. What is happening to the soul of white folk as they embrace the lie that keeps them, that blinds them from an honest and mature assessment of themselves. The last portion of the essay. So the passage around history, which I love, that we carry it with us. And an honest confrontation with our history, with what we've done, actually sets the stage to release us into a different kind of way of being in the world. Baldwin associates innocence with immaturity and freedom with the end of innocence. Freedom involves the risk to step into life, to take a chance with life, to risk oneself, right? Without the comfort of safety and the illusions and the myths. That's the first part of the essay. The second part of the essay is to shift our focus, it seems to me. He's already done it in the beginning, but he invokes in some ways this rift of the veil called the curtain in order to turn our attention to what is happening, not on the black side of town, on that side of the tracks, but what's happening on the white side of town. What's happening in the souls of those who embrace the lie? What's happening to the character of those who tell the story that flatters them? What happens to the soul of those who are satisfied with being impaled on a pin? But this last section of the essay is when he turns to Henry James's novel, The Ambassadors. You know, many of us who read Jamie, we know that Henry James is an ancestor. We see these Jamesian-like sentences all over Baldwin's over 7,000 page corpus, right? But there's something about The Ambassadors and what Henry James is exploring in that novel, and that novel defeats me every time I try to complete it. I'll admit it now. Is this refusal to see the human being right in front of you. It's this unwillingness to encounter the complexity of the life lived, to seek comfort in the illusions and how that arrests the self. And that last line, jazz musicians know this. What do they know? Right? What do they know? He counsels the young man, Mr. Strather, to live all you can. It is a mistake not to hide behind these illusions. Jazz musicians know this. The old men and women of Montgomery, those who waved and sang and wept and could not join the marching, but had brought so many of us to the place where we could march, know this. But white Americans do not know this. Barricaded inside their history, they remain trapped in that factory to which the sun returns. And we have to bear the burden of that trap. Breonna Taylor's mother has to grieve because she's not getting justice because of this innocence that people cling to like a baby clinging to Similac milk. Baldwin, in this essay, distilled, at least in my view, offers us a clear picture of the terror of history and what it might mean to confront it, to run towards one's fears. And it seems to me something that we need to be reading over and over again in this moment, in this time, where the lie is being reasserted with a kind of ferocity that scares the hell out of me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Max.
Thanks so much, Eddie. That was really terrific and powerful. And I think you've opened up a lot of areas for further exploration that I can see some of our viewers are already asking about. Let's talk briefly about the first part of the essay and history. Michael Ryan from New York City asks, does Baldwin ever speak to getting past the duplicity? Did Baldwin think we could escape from history? And to that, let me add Kitty Bateman, who's writing from Queens. So do we get any guidance as to how we as white persons might extricate ourselves from our limited view of history? So I wanted to just take those two questions, just expand them a little bit and to say, you know, as you've said, you know, Baldwin in the essay talks about the road to change is through a confrontation with history and a facing of what's done in the present in the name of the past, as he says, with great pain and terror, and that it's harder for the beneficiaries of that history, in fact, to do that than the victims of the history, he said.
Right.
So I guess just in terms of bringing it to the present, I mean, in the 55 years since the essay was written, have Americans of all kinds, have their views of history changed? A, is there a difference now from then? And second part, is there a reckoning with the American past? Is there a possible reckoning that actually can be both truthful and unite rather than divide people? In terms of lessons for now, how would you, so I know it's a bunch of questions at once, but they're all really the same.
Yeah, so the first thing is to say we can't escape history because history is literally in us, right? And what is Baldwin's answer? I'm trying to get to Katie's part, you know, what does Baldwin offer white America, right? The first thing he's gonna say is tell the truth about what we've done, right? To not seek comfort and safety in illusions and myths, but to confront the reality, right, of our living up to now, right? And so that takes me to the kind of way in which you kind of brought the two questions to another point, right? And that is, right, what kind of story have we told ourselves over the last 55 years? I mean, how do we narrate the Black freedom movement, right? What do we do with Black power? Black power, in my view, constitutes the repressed of contemporary American politics. We have to avoid it. We have to deny its presence. We have to think of it as a moment. Even Bill Clinton invokes Stokely Carmichael as an avatar of a moment when we've gone the wrong way, right? As opposed to dealing with, as what Baldwin insisted that we do, dealing with what made those children cry Black power in the first place, right? Or even in this moment now where we found ourselves grappling with the built environment, with Confederate statues and people claiming that it was heritage. And we know that that's a lie because it's simply a result of a kind of monuments to redemption, to the lost cause. They're monuments to an ideology, right? And even with the 1619 Project and the controversies around the details, right? There is this sense in which what Nicole Hannah-Jones et al. Have tried to do constitutes an anti-American act, when in fact she's simply taking up I take to be what Edward Said writes in that wonderful book Beginnings. The problem of beginning is the beginning of the problem. Where we start, right? What would it mean to tell the story and begin with 1619 as opposed to Plymouth Rock or 1776? What comes into view? So when we ask ourselves the question, what has happened over the last 55 years? I would honestly say, and this is what motivated me writing the book, is that white America is still impaled on the pen. And we're still bearing the burden of it. And that's not to say that my presence at Princeton or the elements of progress aren't real, but we still live in a society where, you know, the value gap obtains. And what is the value gap? And that is the belief that white people matter more than others. And we tell ourselves a story to justify that belief. Does that answer your question, Matt?
I think so. Just to follow that, in your book, you talk about a trip you made to Montgomery to the Legacy Museum and the National Monument for Peace and Justice. And it seems, I mean, you seem to be citing that as an example of the kind of history or the kind of reckoning with history that might lead to the kind of opening and change that Baldwin is talking about. I mean, do you believe that that's true?
I think so. You know, not only the Legacy Museum and the National, you know, and the National Monument Memorial, also what, you know, the Smithsonian of African American culture, you know, African American history is really important. You know, but there's this moment in the book that I write about where I'm in the Legacy Museum, and it's a narrative museum of sorts, but spatially it doesn't lend itself to it. So I found myself walking into the middle. And what I found in being in the middle of the museum, I could hear King's voice. I could hear, you know, the voice of Ross Barnett. I could hear the screams of the Selma March. I could see young people making their way through Supreme Court decisions and recording each of the decisions that had an impact on the question of race in the country. And I write in that moment, this was the cacophonous song of America, right? How do we narrate that story in such a way that unifies is a difficult question. It requires, in some ways, Max, a willingness to relinquish what is often demanded for unity, and that is a compromise of me, right? As what Baldwin would put it this way, as he did in Many Thousands Gone, the precondition for, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the precondition for my entry, for my entree, is to leave the specificity of my life at the door. So he says in Many Thousands Gone, we have to make ourselves blank in order to wash away your guilt. If that's the condition for unity, to hell with that, you know? And that's early Baldwin, right? That's Notes of a Native Son. That's not the Baldwin who's supposedly gone, you know, bad in the teeth and who's bitter and has succumbed to, you know, the propaganda of Black power. That's early Baldwin.
Yeah.
But anyway.
And that's very good. And you make an, I mean, extremely persuasive case in the book for the power and importance of the late Baldwin. And, you know, we recently had an episode like this about No Name in the Street, which made a similar persuasive case, I thought. But I'm glad you mentioned early and late Baldwin, and also the question of Black power and Baldwin's changing relationship to it, because a number of questions circle around that.
Oh, okay.
Nick Stevens at Evanston, Illinois says, you describe a shift in Baldwin's thinking and beliefs in later life. When did the change occur and why? And by the 70s, was he more aligned with Malcolm or Martin? There's another question from Carl Dix from New York, saying, how does Baldwin's we change? Because you talk about that in the book as well, which seemed to include everyone. And how does that affect us today when we're trying to assemble a we that will open a door to a different future? So I guess these questions are really circling on the same question, which is, if you could talk a little bit about Baldwin's evolving political commitments, you know, and in response to changing American realities at the time, or his understanding of them, and what that also means for us now.
You know, I'm trying to do a couple of things in making an intervention in those of us who write about Jimmy, and that is, you know, I want to first, and I think in the academy, pretty much people have just kind of rejected Campbell's claim that Jimmy's voice broke in '63. I mean, I think that's just wrong on its face, and wrong for obvious reasons. But I do want to suggest, though, that the periodization of Jimmy as early and late can only take us so far, and it actually obscures more than it reveals, because I think there's a continuity of theme that runs across Baldwin's corpus, but the material conditions under which he's thinking about it, the political landscape shifts, which leads to a kind of shift in accents. Baldwin is concerned with history, he's concerned with identity. The moral question is motivating the work from Go Tell It on the Mountain, No Name in the Street, to Evidence of Things Not Seen. He's thinking about this at a very complex level. So I think it's wrong to ask the question, who was he closest to, Martin or Malcolm? I think Baldwin, at least for me, allows me to because the rage, as I write, lights the kiln, right? Allows me to rage and to love, right? And it seems to me that Baldwin's formation in the ghettos of Harlem, in the alleyways of Greenwich and Paris, right, gives him a certain angle on experience that isn't, say, you know, bourgeois Atlanta's orientation. And I'm thinking about Dr. King as a child of preacherly royalty in some ways. Baldwin is not coming from that place. He's not coming from Sugar Hill. So there might be an attraction in that sense, but I think at the level of detail, he understands Malcolm's rage, but he's always worried about the rage and the anger transforming into hatred. Because the moment it becomes hatred, you're stuck, you're trapped. Even in this essay, he talks about us being trapped, right, in this cycle of the history that justifies the world as it is, and our believing it, and our thinking that the only way we can get free is by, in some ways, duplicating it in our own lives, right, or pursuing that same pathway. So I think it's important not to read him as identifying with Malcolm or Martin, but to see him as a third way, right, as a figure that brings both together. How do you periodize the change, the shift? It's hard. I mean, you can see it as early as '64 in Blues for Mr. Charlie, right? When you read that play and you see it, there's a shift, right? Baldwin never becomes, an explicit adherent of the Black arts movement, but you can see elements early on, right? I tend to locate it, the hard shift with the assassination of Dr. King in '68. They killed the apostle of love. And Baldwin was not naive about human capacity, the human capacity for evil. He wasn't naive about that. He understood the nature of unwanted touch and violence. But it's something about what did the murder of King say about them? And then the fact that he tries to commit suicide in '69, there's a collapse. And then of course, No Name in the Street in '72 is the book that emerges out of that, where he picks up the pieces. So to answer the short question, I'm not being short, but to answer that question very quickly, is that I tend to locate it around '68. Now, Carl's question around the we is really important because Baldwin's we is constantly moving and shifting. You know, going back to Many Thousands Gone, one minute he's sounding like he's taking on the voice of white people. Another minute he's speaking from the vantage point of Black folk. Another minute he's engaged in this aspirational we, right? But you know, I went to Amherst, Massachusetts to visit with the professor Michael Thelwell, and who co-authored the autobiography with Kwame Ture at Stokely Carmichael, and who wrote the novel version of The Harder They Come. And you know, Thelwell is an exacting reader, and I remember him giving him the first 4 chapters of the book, and I walked into the house and he says to me, Glaude, I thought you were a smart man. This is nonsense. And he begins to destroy the book. And then we got to talking and he says, Baldwin's we shifted. So when we read The Fire next time, the revolutionary inversion happens, that the problem isn't us, the problem is them. The problem are those who are committed to the lie and what it does to them, and we have to bear the burden of it. And because we have to bear the burden of it, my nephew, we have to get them to see themselves differently. We have to love them into a way of seeing themselves differently. That second part drops out, I believe, in the latter part of Baldwin's career. And that is, he's not so much concerned about convincing those who are committed to noxious views that they ought not hold them. I think the way in which I translate it is that, you know, we only have a finite amount of civic energy, and we can't spend that energy trying to convince those who hold noxious views not to hold them. We need to spend that energy building a new Jerusalem. And so the we, Carl, in this moment is aspirational. It's not reducible to a kind of mystical Black community. He rejected that out of hand, right? It's not a liberal we either, right? It's a radical we committed to what he calls the New Jerusalem, which is, in my parlance, a more just world where domination doesn't obtain, if that makes sense. That's a lot. I'll be shorter with my answers because I know we have questions.
No, be longer. They're great answers. Well, to follow that up a little bit about the question of the we and the you and the they, I mean, yeah. It feels like white man's guilt is kind of in the middle in a certain way. I mean, it starts off talking about, you know, I wonder what white people talk about with each other in secret, which sounds like he's talking to, you know, other Black people, but then there's, you know, white man hear me. But then there's that, you know, that incredible move, as you say, at the end to the ambassadors. And, you know, he goes from the prophetic fury of white man hear me to, you know, to the sympathetic reading of Lambert Strether and Shad Newsom, of whom, you know, whiter than that you don't get, you know. So I'm curious, you know, how you think about that, like who's being, you know, in terms of what's his spiritual position, I guess in a certain is really a question. And that leads to this next question from Jason Vest, professor of English at University of Guam.
Oh, wow.
Who frames this interestingly. He says, in The Fire Next Time, he quotes Baldwin saying, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. He says, was Baldwin's diagnosis correct then, and is it correct now? Or does it give too much credit to such people? Isn't the pain that white nationalists have inflicted and continue to inflict, doesn't that dwarf any pain they themselves might experience. And he goes on to say, but maybe I'm wrong and ungenerous. And does Baldwin's way of thinking show his compassion and generosity of spirit that we should extend, all of us, even to the cruel and thoughtless people living among us?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I mean, it's a central question, Baldwin, obviously, and you were talking about rage and love already, but I'm curious about how you would answer Professor Vest, and also how you would think about that answer in the context of this essay, which on the one hand rages against, you know, white people and for certain things, and yet at the same time opens into this beautiful, you know, reading of the ambassadors at the end, which is all about the damage that Chad Newsom has done to himself by making the choice.
Right. I mean, this is so great. This is so good. So I don't take Baldwin, or at least I don't read him, and I may be wrong. I never read Baldwin as engaging in a comparison of pains, right? The depth of my suffering in relation to the depth of your suffering. Typically, Baldwin reads suffering as the bridge. We think about the artist's struggle for integrity, right? Or that little note that I found in his letters at the Schomburg, where he's writing to Bobby Kennedy after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he says, I know something of your pain, and it is akin to the pain that we were trying to get you to see in that disastrous meeting that they had earlier. But the pain becomes the bridge, right? So, of course, Baldwin would want to acknowledge the depth of the suffering caused by those who are committed to white supremacy in the way that they are and in what they do. You know, that rope, the torture, you know, the fire, the rope, the torture. Remember that extraordinary paragraph in The Fire Next Time. And then he ends it with what will happen to all of that beauty, right? I mean, this is extraordinary, right? So he's not going to downplay the depth of the cruelty and barbarity that we have to bear. He's not going to do that. But he's also going to say, and here he might very well be in line with Jefferson in his notes, or even de Tocqueville, that the very act distorts and disfigures the character of those who engage in it, that they themselves have become monstrous. And what does it mean to describe that in its detail, right? That, you know, that moment when Jefferson is talking about in the notes of a child witnessing the beating, and how the child is nursed and educated in that violence, in that brutality, and what that generates, what he calls those odious peculiarities, as he writes in the notes, right? And so part of what I think Baldwin is saying in this moment, right, is that this distortion of the self, right? The world is let me say it differently. The messiness of the world is a reflection of the messiness of our interior lives, right? And understanding what motivates these people to embrace this ideology and to act upon it is important for us not to duplicate it, so that we don't become monstrous too. So that powerful line in Letter and Resignation from the Liberator, right? I want us to do something unprecedented, and that is to create a self without a need for enemies. Or the moment he says, we cannot become them, right? And them, of course, is the generality. So I'm trying to answer the question in that sense. Am I getting to it? Am I getting off track, Max? Right. So
No, I think
so
right.
I don't think it's about you know, him being generous to white people. I think he's trying to understand the dialectic, right? And the nature of the trap. Because look at this line on page 725 in the text, right? Oh, I'm sounding like I'm at Princeton in the precept. Sorry. All right. At the bottom of 724 going to 725. I'm sorry. He said, moreover, the history of white people has led them to a fearful, baffling place where they have begun.
You're accidentally muted.
Did I mute?
Oh, okay.
Okay, am I back now?
Yeah.
He says, Moreover, the history of white people has led them to a fearful, baffling place where they have begun to lose touch with reality, to lose touch, that is, with themselves, and where they certainly are not truly happy, for they know they're not truly safe. They do not know how this came about. They do not dare examine how this came about. And look, on the one hand, they can scarcely dare to open a dialogue, which must, if it is honest, become personal confession, a cry for help, a healing, which is really, I think, the basis of all dialogues. And on the other hand, the Black man, sick, can scarcely dare to open a dialogue, which must, if it is honest, become a personal confession, which fatally contains an accusation. And yet, if neither of us cannot do this, each of us will perish in those traps in which we have been struggling for so long. One way in which he parses this is that we're all stuck in history's ass pocket. Right. And so he's trying to get us out of this. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on.
No, that's good. I mean, a related question is, Jarrell Robinson Brown says, what role did the church play in Baldwin's thought and practice? And I know this is, you know, kind of up your alley and your discipline. And, you know, a lot of, I guess the question is, you know, is the background to a lot of what you're talking about, does that point to the influence of religion on Baldwin? And we, you know, this came up in, is it a religious vision in part? And you know, in No Name in the Street, which is kind of structured like a conversion narrative, although it's a strange kind of conversion narrative. And I mean, the epigraph is, you know, I told Jesus he could change my name. And you know, the later line is, you know, Jesus told me people would hate me if he changed my name. And that's the situation Baldwin found himself in, of course, at that moment, which was getting it from all sides. So, you know, I'm just curious, how do you think about the role of the church in Baldwin's thinking and in his writing?
I mean, Baldwin himself said it, you know, he left the church, but the church never left him. He still thinks of, you know, that jumping Pentecostal experience as the best theater he ever experienced, you know? So he's indelibly marked by that. His language is, you know, shaped not only by Henry James and the way in which he's engaging, you know, Proust and others, but, you know, King James Bible. It's shaped by the blues tradition and Black vernacular. It's shaped by the Black homiletic tradition, right? But I think it's important for us to kind of think about what we might mean when we describe it as religious. What is that? What are we trying to suggest there? I think if one wants to find, and Clarence Hardy has written an interesting book on this in this regard, and the late James Cone, the Black liberation theologian, was writing a book on Baldwin at the time of his passing. So I'm really interested with what happened, with how he treated him. But I think, you know, for me, the clearest vision of his theology, if we want to call it that, is to crush a serpent. The last essay published in Playboy. And here Baldwin is responding to, you know, Jerry Falwell and the moral majority and conservative evangelicals, right? And offering a vision of love and salvation that is about connection. And it's in some ways the only time that I've read it over the course of all of the works that I've read of his, where he uses safety positively, where he says safety is found in complexity, right, in that moment. But he offers salvation, a view of salvation that isn't about separation at all, right? It's about the vulnerability found in the willingness to love, which means the willingness to risk oneself, right? Which means, you know, in some ways, a kind of freedom, because what is freedom? The end of innocence. What is the end of innocence? The willingness to step into the fray, right? And to accept the consequences, something America refuses to do over and over again. So, you know, so we have to kind of complicate it, because it's not easy to kind of bring him, right, to just say he's, you know, Pentecostal Christian or something like that. It's a complicated answer.
You make an analogy in the book, and your book is kind of built on this analogy between, you know, the dark place, I suppose you could say, that, you know, Baldwin moved toward for reasons you've already talked about, and the place that we find ourselves in now, where, you know, a certain era or moment of hopefulness was met recalcitrance and worse, violent backlash. And a lot of your book is talk about where it talks about how Baldwin found the resources to, as you say, begin again.
Right.
And you know, I wonder, you know, there was a question from Sue Richard of Pennsylvania saying, did Baldwin feel he made a difference with his writings and his speaking? And how can we bring his vision to fruition, asks Dee Roselli from Los Angeles. But those questions also speak to this larger question of, you know, what can we learn from, well, we also say that you make this beautiful, you have a beautiful comparison of Baldwin's writing to John Coltrane's suite, A Love Supreme, a masterwork, and, you know, Coltrane's, the yearning and kind of tenacious struggle with difficulty and darkness to get to some other place. And you compare Baldwin's writing to that. And I just want to hear you talk about that and what we can learn from that. I mean, you know, Baldwin, you quote him as saying, my whole effort is to try to bear witness to something which will have to be there when the storm is over to help us get through the next storm. Almost as if they're looking at us, like Walt Whitman, sometimes you feel is like looking at you, you know. So, you know, that's all a question, really. Like, you know, talk about Baldwin beginning again and what that takes and what it involved for him, and also what does it teach us now?
Yeah, it's a hard question or series of questions, right? You know, when you read the last interviews, Baldwin is saying sometimes he felt like a broken record, a broken motor rather. Right? You can only go to Texas so many times, he would say, right? Saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. And he says, right, I know what happened. He knew why the nation chose Reagan. He knew, he understood why we reached for that fantasy in 1980. And I think he understood, by way of reading him closely, I understand why we've reached for hours in this moment. A B-list Hollywood actor or reality TV show, you know, figure. How did he muster the energy? Well, it had everything, I think, to do with, and this is really something important to say, I think, has everything to do with how love motivates him, right? And I'm not talking about some syrupy love, right? I'm not talking about, you know, as he would say in Fire Next Time, it's a love that's daring and growth, right? It's a love that requires vulnerability, right? Because we must, like lovers, dare to achieve our country. That is, you must take the risk. You must make yourself vulnerable in that moment. You can see the bare, you know, all of the blemishes of my naked body, right? In No Name in the Street, he says, you know what love when you've laid, you know, with someone naked together in a bed, right? So it's not just simply agape. It's eros, it's philia. It's all elements. And the way in which I parse it is like this, Max, you know, it's like the enslaved woman. You know, I wrote my first book on early 19th century and uses of the Exodus story. But I'm thinking about those enslaved women, an enslaved woman who the experiences of her life leads her. There's nothing in the experiences of her life which would lead her to believe that anything could be otherwise. There's nothing in her life that could lead her to believe that she could live otherwise. But she could look in the eyes of a man and see love, even though he could be snatched from her at any moment. And that glimmer could be a source of something. Or she could hear in the yard, just for a minute, the sound of innocence with children laughing, even though they will experience the theft of innocence at any moment. And that experience of love becomes the condition, the ground for the possibility to reach for it otherwise. Baldwin says hope is invented every day. And that's not Voltaire's Candide, that's not Pangloss. That's trying to figure out how you're going to get up in the morning. So what do I learn from the Baldwin who's drinking too much Johnny Walker Black, who's smoking right, who's trying to grapple with his own demons, who said he's hurt many a person because he never felt love, right? How do I talk about his insistence on continuing to trying to bear witness? Is he loved us to death even when cancer ravaged his throat, right? The love for the gaggle of nieces and nephews and for us, you know? That sounds a bit abstract, but, you know, he says, and this comes from just above my head, the last volume right here, right? Responsibility is not lost, is abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, even when you're in your darkest moment, right? If you refuse abdication, you begin again, right? And thank God, the people out of the tradition, the people who make up the tradition out of which I come, thank God they did that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking.
You've said that Baldwin's writing is at the center of a conversation about American democracy and its future. That's happened in the academy, and it's happened, I think, more broadly now. What do you mean by that?
I think Baldwin is perhaps the most insightful critic of race and democracy we've ever produced. You know, he's Emerson on the other side of the tracks, right? And his insistence that we understand the moral question at the heart of this fragile experiment in democracy. But the question is, who do we take ourselves to be? Who do we aspire to be? And to answer that question requires, you know, it's a hard question. It requires, you know, to take rude positions in some ways. It requires telling ourselves the truth, right? It requires putting aside childish things. And it's at the heart of, I think, the entire corpus, right? You know, when we evade, right, the ugliness of this life, right? When we evade the difficulty of what it means to make our way from womb to tomb, right? And so this is what Baldwin is saying in 1963. We have to earn our death by embracing, right, with passion, the conundrum of life, right? But we're a life-dodging country. We prefer our illusions, whether they're cowboys or Marvel heroes, you know?
Yeah. We should have time for one last question and answer. I think we should make it a personal one, because there are a number of questions. Coretta Pittman from Waco, Texas said, you know, what drew you to Baldwin's work in the first place, and why have you made it at the center of your academic work now? And Ricardo Colasar from Jersey City, New Jersey, wonders what Baldwin's writings and this essay in particular have meant as an influence on you, both in terms of your as a historian, but also as a person.
Yeah, you know, I write in the book that I was evading Baldwin for the longest. You know, I preferred Ellison in the early days because his mask fit so neatly, right? There was an elegance, a pose that kept people at a distance. And when I read Ellison with my white colleagues, I didn't have to deal with red cheeks. I didn't have to deal with blushed faces, right? We just dealt with, oh, look at the Burkean formulation. He's reading the philosophy of literary form. You could tell this is Bildungsroman, roman, right? We could do all of that, right? But Baldwin, I knew that Baldwin was going to ask me some questions, that he was going to force me back onto myself. And I barely survived writing this book. I keep saying it over and over again, and I mean it without any hyperbole. I found myself drinking too much Irish whiskey because he forced me to confront the scaffolding of my own lies. Yeah. The scaffolding of my own lies. And that required me to deal with the fact that I'm a vulnerable little boy. who's been trying to prove that he's not a coward because my dad deposited fear in my gut from an early age. My dad, who's a very good friend now, but you know, it took a while to get there. So Baldwin became this resource for me to think carefully about American democracy, about American pragmatism, and to keep myself in view, to not hide. And I finally decided to bring him from backstage up front because I wanted to take the chance to finally be a writer, right? To not try to imitate his sentences on the page, but to dare to be what I was feeling that I actually am. But we can talk about that some other time. Academically, what does, you know, and in my writing, Baldwin lets me be fragile and vulnerable. He lets me revel in my own brilliance. He insists that I affirm me. He created himself. You think about this, from where he came, from the ghettos of Harlem. He willed himself into becoming one of the most extraordinary writers the world has ever seen. It's a phenomenal act of self-creation. And it's an extraordinary example. So I keep that in mind as I walk with him.
Beautiful. Thank you deeply for that wonderful hour. You've been listening to Professor Eddie Glaude discuss James Baldwin's essay, The White Man's Guilt, published by Library of America in James Baldwin's Collected Essays, edited by Toni Morrison. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Tuesday, October 13th, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, Revisiting Richard Hofstadter in the Time of Trump, a discussion featuring Sean Wilentz, Eric Foner, Arlie Hochschild, and moderator Ira Katznelson. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's James Baldwin and Richard Hofstadter editions and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Eddie Glaude for a terrific hour, and everyone have a great evening.